We are ready. So over to you, Jim.
All right, Bratislav, thanks very much. And I really appreciate Agile Bratislava for setting this up. I remember when Bratislav first popped up on LinkedIn, and it was before I met you at the course. And I thought, who is this guy? And then we actually met up at a Scrum Patterns course, and one thing led to another, so here we are. And I'd like to thank all of you for showing up. I really appreciate it when people sign up and then they actually show up. So we have 29 people who actually signed up and showed up. We have a lot of material to cover today. I'm going to cover it very briefly, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm going to spend 30 to 40 minutes talking. I may pause halfway through. You have a question app where you can submit your questions and vote on other people's questions. And I may check halfway through to see where we are, to see if there's any burning questions before we go on and continue. Hope we have some good discussions. So this is about Scrum patterns. I trust that most of you took the little quiz. I'd like to go through that. And after I'm done, I'll describe why I had you do this quiz. So what's the goal of the daily Scrum? Well, it's to replan the work until the next daily Scrum. And if we look at what you answered, great, you really did great. So overall score so far, 63%. The next question, the product backlog is in what order? The right answer is in delivery order. Oh, your score went way down there. All right, the next one. The product backlog is a list of product increments and features. It is not a list of requirements. There are no user stories in Scrum. I don't want to see a user story on your product backlog or on your sprint backlog. User stories stop with the product owner. It's a product backlog, not a requirements backlog, okay? But maybe most of you got that right. The product backlog is a roadmap. Well, no, it's not a roadmap. A roadmap has decisions and branching. There's no branching in a product backlog. A product backlog is a tentatively committed plan of record based on the best thing we know right now. At any point, the product backlog is the best known path through the roadmap. What is a sprint review? So most of you said it's a demo. Well, no, the demo is only about a half hour or so. It's a very small part. What the sprint review is an event with wide-ranging discussions. So your score went down again. Okay, but about half of you got this right anyhow. Or, well, no, a third of you. What best describes the relationship between the product owner and the development team? This one, you all did pretty well. The PO and the developers define the product backlog together, but the product owner has the final say. What percentage of a sprint should a great Scrum team fail, where fail is defined here? It's not completing everything on the sprint backlog. And most of you said 0%. Now I know you all go to your customers and your managers and say, wow, we completed this. We completed every sprint. We haven't failed a single sprint. What's the answer? 50%. If you are not failing 50% of your sprints, you're lying, you're cheating, you're cooking the books. This shows you probably don't understand velocity. You all know what a burn down chart is, right? So here's a burn down chart, but here the velocity isn't 235, it's 235 plus or minus 20%, because this is a complex system, it has variance. So the velocity number that we use is the median. We'll take the average of the past 3 sprints or use yesterday's weather. But some of the time the velocity will be higher and we'll actually deliver more. And half the time the sprint doesn't finish. We don't finish all the sprint backlog items. if the velocity is the median, what is the percentage that delivers more? 50%. And what's the percentage that don't finish? 50%. So what you should do, the whole purpose of lean is to reduce the variance. So we should reduce the variance to 10%. And now things are a lot better. Now, what percentage of your sprints do you deliver early? Well, 50%. And 50% don't deliver, but the leakage is cut in half. Now, in fact, you don't get points for completing everything on the sprint backlog. The goal of a sprint is to complete the sprint goal. If you are looking at it by counting PBIs or things finished on the sprint backlog, you're a feature factory and you don't understand Scrum. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. All right. Last question, what's the value of certification? Most of you got this right. Certification doesn't make a bit of difference. So I'm trying to build a community where certification and money are a lot less important. I get very concerned about the certification bodies, all of them, and how it changes our behavior and sets expectations. The reason I give this quiz, look at your score. So I mean, you're Scrum folks, right? That's why you came to this thing, right? You're not waterfall people, you're not project managers. So here you are, you're the best and brightest of the Scrum folks in Bratislava, and you scored less than 50% on basic fundamental questions of Scrum. Now it turns out you're better than most people. Most people, it's closer to 35%. And here you got between 40 and 50%. So but you're still less than half. And I mean, I started seeing this many years ago, and I said, all right, this is deplorable. And I don't know if it's just that people have trouble making the paradigm shift, or if the trainers simply don't understand Scrum. And I know in some of the cases, that's true. Don't confuse Scrum with the Scrum Alliance. I mean, a lot of the questions on the test, the answer that they're looking for is just wrong. The people who wrote the test don't understand Scrum. When Jeff Sutherland first took the test, he didn't pass the test. I think he knows Scrum, okay? So I said, look, we need a better standard for what Scrum is, and that's where the patterns discipline comes from. So there's kind of 4 things to keep in mind about these patterns, or 4 things we're trying to help you do when you adapt Scrum by using these patterns rather than just attending a certification course. So the first is, I mean, Scrum is, 3 roles and 3 artifacts and 5 events. And that's kind of a simple description of Scrum. If you look at the details, it's a lot more than that. And maybe there's 100 or 200 things you need to do. Well, does everybody need to do all 100 or 200? Does everybody need to use estimation points? Or can you estimate by splitting everything down to the same on the sprint backlog and using the no estimates technique? Well, you know a lot more about your Scrum team than anybody making certification does. And so what we wanted to do is present a menu of things that are suggestions for things you should strongly consider when you implement Scrum, rather than saying, you need to do all of these things. Now, Scrum isn't too bad about this. Extreme programming was much worse about this. Extreme programming said, to be extreme programming, you must do all the principles and all the practices. And that's just bullshit, okay? And the same is true of Scrum, but people get this feeling, if I'm not doing exactly what the Scrum guide says, I'm doing it wrong. Well, no, that's just crap. The second is that we want you to be able to try out one Scrum feature at a time. Like, just try out, time boxing your daily stand-up to 15 minutes. And then practice. Change your format, change the way you run it until you can meet that 15-minute time box. And then once you've met that 15-minute time box, then go on to another part of Scrum and implement that. So instead of just trying to do all of Scrum at once and getting confused and failing at everything and getting lost, What we wanted to do is make a roadmap that helps you build up to a more and more powerful Scrum all the time. So we've broken Scrum down into pieces that build on each other. Third, I wanted something that was authoritative. So I got together the most knowledgeable Scrum people in the world. Jeff Sutherland, who invented Scrum. Gabriella Benefield, who probably knows more about product ownership than anyone in the world. Jens Østergaard, who has trained more people in Scrum than anyone in the world. Mike Beadle, who co-authored the first Scrum book. 20 people like that. So this is the creme de la creme of Scrum. And we spent 9 years looking at our experience, looking at our clients, refining, talking, communicating, and documenting what really works. So at some level, we really didn't care if it was in the Scrum Guide. It's got to really work, and we have to know why it works. So we wanted this to stand on authority, and we wanted to be able to argue why each of these things really works. And if that doesn't apply to you, well, then do something else. So all these things together are about raising the bar. And this is more in line with kind of Jeff's expectations for Scrum. I mean, a lot of people will come to Scrum training to try to increase their productivity or their throughput by 10 or 20%. No, I mean, Jeff invented Scrum to increase your output by a factor of 10, by a factor of 100. And if you look at the Scrum teams who can get beyond the Scrum Guide and can start looking at themselves as people and looking at the system, they are more likely to be able to get these large, great, powerful changes than the teams that are just trying to do spreadsheet adoption of Scrum. So this was kind of the goal behind the pattern discipline. And there were 20 of us who spent 9 years doing this, and then the book was published last August. Now, just a couple of slides, and Bratislav, these were not in the deck I sent you. These are new. This is a talk on patterns, and we have all these people out there. A lot of them are programmers. And when I say pattern, they probably think, oh, he means like the Gang of Four patterns. Well, if you think it's about the Gang of Four patterns, there isn't a single pattern in the Gang of Four book. And I've told them this for years and years and years. And finally, I got this mail from Richard Helm, one of the Gang of Four, in 2004. This is after the book was out a few years. The email is entitled A Confession and a Request. He says, "Hi, Cope. I can't recall the last time we spoke or met. The confession, I finally grokked. Grok means to understand deeply. I finally grokked generative patterns and piecemeal growth longly through a long, tortuous route, largely through some interesting universal properties of software, scale-free and small worldness. I bet slow I am sometimes, but got there in the end." So the author of the patterns book did not understand what patterns were when he wrote the book. Oh, here's another one. Eric didn't understand either. There's this little Twitter sequence where Eric humbly says, well, okay, yeah, you're right. Coplien eventually taught us this. So what a pattern is a moral imperative. It's something we build. It's part of structure. It's part of a system. And it comes out of something called a pattern language. And I'm not going to go into a lot of depth in pattern languages here in the next half hour, but there's a lot of very deep systems thinking and systems consideration to documenting something as a pattern that goes far, far, far beyond what you're going to find in anything in the Gang of Four book. This, for example, is a pattern. This is one of my favorite patterns. This is by Ward Cunningham. Ward Cunningham is the guy who invented wikis. And this is not a very structured pattern, but it starts with a context and kind of a description of the trade-offs. And it says when you read, your eye has to come back to the beginning of a line, and then it goes across, and it comes back to the beginning of a line, and it goes across. And it comes back to the beginning of a line, it has to kind of hunt around to find where to go. That's called fixing. In order to read effectively, you want the eye to not have to search very far. Therefore, when you're formatting columns of text on a web page, they should be fairly narrow, about 10 words long. So this is a pattern. It's one of several other patterns. I mean, this goes together with other patterns for putting together text-rich web pages that together build on each other to make a web page. It's very small, it's very local, it's very simple. Good patterns are very simple and very small. They do incremental change. A pattern builds something. It tells you when to build it, and it tells you what to build. I can draw a picture of a pattern. If I can't draw a picture of it, it's not a pattern. So these things appeal very much to the right brain and to the visual cortex. And there's a lot of psychological foundations behind, for example, the parallelism of the right brain in being able to master systems thinking and to be able to think in terms of the whole system rather than just think locally, and yet still be able to modify the system locally. So there's something very, very deep going on in patterns. It's more than just a best practice, but it's something that has a much deeper social and psychological grounding. Another thing about patterns, here's a pattern you probably all know. Now, the first pattern book, organizational pattern book I wrote is that one you can see on the screen there, Organizational Patterns. That's from back in 2004, and I co-authored it with Neil Harrison. And that's where we published this pattern, developing in pairs. And we can see the funny picture here of the two Mexican guys who developed in pairs. And the pattern is roughly, well, software development is mistake prone. We have bugs that come up, and reviews are not enough to solve the problems. Therefore, allow but don't force people to work in pairs. Have 4 eyes on the code all the time. So this again is a pattern. It's a structure. It's something I build. It's a very, very small temporary organization of 2 people that I build. Now, if you're sitting at a whiteboard talking about your organization, I mean, you might draw 2 people, sitting at a desk together saying, okay, well, here are these 2 people who are working together. That's pair programming. So this is a pattern. All the patterns in the organizational patterns book are fair game for Scrum too. We didn't want to copy them into the new book again. But this is from a book that's 15 years old. Now, what's pair programming? Where did it come from? Who invented pair programming? Oh, Kent Beck and extreme programming, right? That's what everyone says, right? Well, okay, I knew better than that. So I started asking some people, and Tom Gilb, who's an American living in Norway, is saying, well, Jim Coplien invented it in 1995. Well, I knew that wasn't true. Trygve Vanskog, who's the inventor of Model View Controller, good friend of mine, said, well, I did a project in the late 1980s where we did pair programming. And Larry Constantine, who, if you're a young person, you probably don't know who Larry Constantine is, but he's one of the inventors of structured programming. So he's one of the early great computer scientists and a good friend of mine. And he says, I think it was PJ Plogger. A lot of people say it was me, but it wasn't me. I think it was PJ Plogger. And then I talked to Ed Jordan, who's another early computer scientist. He says, yeah, I think it was PJ Plogger. And he tells a lovely little story here. He says that the terminals were very, very expensive. And so we insisted that programmers share them, that 2 programmers had to program at the same time for cost effectiveness of use of the terminals. And that's where pair programming came from. Lovely little story. And then I talked to Jerry Weinberg, and Jerry said, well, I learned it on paper back in the 1950s from Bernie Dimsdale, and he learned it from John von Neumann. So it probably doesn't go back much further than that. And then I told Ed Jordan this, and he says, well, it's got to go all the way back to Charles Babbage and Lady Lovelace. Yeah, I'm sure they were pairing. And then I talked to Brian Kernighan, and he said, I have no recollection of any of the history of pair programming, and I certainly have no involvement with it at all. But people in computer science don't understand history, and they think, okay, well, pair programming is this modern, new, whiz-bang, agile thing that came from Kent Beck. Well, no. I mean, this comes all the way back to John von Neumann, So we're looking for things that really work, that have been around for a long time, that are laws of nature, that are laws of organization, that we know we can depend on. These are not PhD theses. These are not conference papers. These are not the great idea you had in the shower last night. Here's another one, daily Scrum. So how do you read a pattern? Usually the title is in small caps. And then we have 3 dots that say this is part of a sequence of other patterns that fit together. And we have a context that says, well, here's what's going on. Here's where you are. Here's what we can assume. So we have a Scrum team, and they're creating a sprint backlog and trying to achieve a sprint goal. But even though they have a sprint backlog that was planned at the beginning of the sprint, we know that as soon as you start work, that everything falls apart. Then there are 3 stars. Then we go into the definition of the problem. So the team makes progress by finishing sprint backlog items, but sprint backlog items are always changing because of emergent requirements. So replanning is good, but too much re-estimation and replanning is muda, it's waste. Therefore, we have a solution in bold: have a short event every day to replan the sprint. Keep the meeting to 15 minutes or less. So this is a pattern. Here's a little more of the solution. If you want to, and you're a very, very immature team, you can get the information you need to replan the sprint by asking 3 questions. I mean, the purpose of sprint planning, the purpose of the daily Scrum is to replan the sprint. It's not a group hug. It's not to report to the Scrum Master. It's not to answer the 3 questions. It's to replan the sprint. It's a small sprint planning meeting. And in order to do replanning, you need to know where you are, that is what you finished, what you plan to do today, and if there's any impediments that stand in your way. But it's not like you have a form and everyone answers these 3 questions. You start planning. You just sit down and you start making a plan. If you run into impediment, you say, oh, we have this impediment that we have to work around. And you report the impediment. So it's everybody doing everything all the time. That's what Scrum means. If we look at the original papers from Scrum, they come from Nonaka and Takeuchi, who use the word Scrum to refer to overlapping tasks. So the Scrum in rugby, where people overlap each other, they have their arms around each other, that's supposed to be reminiscent of overlapping tasks. That is, you cannot have a PERT chart, you can't have a Gantt chart. Everybody is doing everything all the time. That's exactly what Scrum means. But people like to have these structured meetings and say, okay, well, we'll answer the 3 questions and then move on. And then we've applied this. Well, the world has changed. What's our new world now that we have the daily Scrum? Well, okay, we still need to maybe work on some other things. Is this going to be enough to get us to the sprint goal? How does this help achieve team pride? How does this relate to face-to-face before working remotely? So this is a pattern. This is the pattern in detail daily Scrum. So we have 94 of these that we put together in this book. About half of them are for building your Scrum organization, which includes the Scrum team, the METASCRUM, Birds of a Feather, the Scrum of Scrums, the daily Scrum, all those organizational things. And the other half is for building your value stream. So your value stream is the time part of Scrum, the process part of Scrum. So that's what the product backlog is. It's how a feature moves through time. Through time, it moves up the product backlog, and then it moves into the sprint backlog, and then it moves into a product increment. So in that part of the patterns, we're talking about how features move through time. Now, more deeply, you need to understand what Scrum is. So it's a framework, right? All the books say it's a framework, right? And it's a framework for building a product, right? Is Scrum a framework for building a product? What does Scrum say about building a product? Absolutely nothing. What Scrum tells us how to do is how to build a process and how to build an organization. And that process and that organization build the product. So what we're building here is a process and organization. The Japanese say, build the right process, you'll build the right product. And that's what Scrum is. So we have a process, which is this value stream that starts with requirements and funding and a vision. And these things flow down the value stream into a product increment with team members along the edges. And then we have an organizational structure that talks about how people relate to each other. Well, people relate to each other in a development team as one mind. We have a Scrum team that includes a product owner and a Scrum master. The teams coordinate through Scrum of Scrums and so forth. So we're looking at the architecture of Scrum, both its architecture in time, which is this value stream, and its architecture as an organization. Now, we structure these patterns in what we call a pattern language. So you can think of this is the pattern language for the organizational structure, and it's kind of a grammar. And it's a grammar for where the sentences in the grammar are collections of patterns strung together. So the order in which you apply patterns matters. And this graph shows the precedence of what patterns have to come before what other patterns. So you can apply a pattern only if its parents have been applied. Other than that, there's really no rules. Well, you start at the top and you work your way toward the bottom. And what you try to do is find the weakest part in your organization and then find a pattern from this selection that you can legally apply, that is, all of its parents have been applied, and then you try it out. This is for the organizational structure. There's another pattern language for the value stream. So we can see things here like the product backlog in the upper left-hand corner. The sprint backlog is kind of in the middle. So the product backlog flows into the sprint backlog. There's a pattern, pigs estimate. Only developers estimate, right? Aggregate velocity and so forth. We have a production episode, which is the part of the sprint where the team builds something, and they produce a regular product increment. After that, we have the retrospective, the sprint review, testable improvements, greatest value, and eventually all products die. This ends in a pattern called product wake. So these are the two pattern languages. I want to end by going through a few patterns, but is this a good time to do a checkpoint and see if there's any burning questions? Is there anything I need to attend to right now?
So I guess maybe from looking at the slide out, there might be one that you would want to touch on. I guess the number one is basically, how do you know if you've discovered a pattern?
So a pattern is something you build. It's structural, it has form, it solves a problem. We know it works. We have found at least 3 independently invented uses of it. That is, 3 different organizations or 3 different countries in the world have all come up with this without communicating with each other. It has a strong human component. It is somewhat artistic. It cannot be automated. And it leads to something that we call wholeness or beauty or peace or the quality without a name. So it's something that makes a system more whole. And it's proven, it's something that you probably were born with, but it got driven out of you by your Scrum certification training, or by your PMI training, or by your academic degree, or by your culture. It's something that's naturally human, that some social structure has driven out of you. So these are just trying to help you reconnect with your true self and how the world really works, instead of how we pretend it works in playing these power games of product management and economics. Now, I mean, we have a whole 3-day course to answer that question, but that's kind of as curt an answer as I can give, here in a 1-minute answer. But it's basically about knowing yourself. What I'll do is at the end of this, I'll send you a URL to a video, which is a keynote I gave at the regional Scrum gathering in Tokyo in January. That is a 1-hour talk that answered this question, and it will blow your mind. Anything else? All right, let's move on.
Nope, you can move on.
All right, so here's another one, product backlog, and I'm not going to go through these. I think you all kind of know what a product backlog is. Well, I don't know. Looking at the exam scores, maybe you don't. I mean, you you didn't know it was in delivery order. What are the elements of a product backlog? They're product increments. What is a product increment? A product increment is something that achieves a sprint goal for that sprint. When a product owner builds their initial product backlog, it's a list of sprint goals. The purpose of the daily Scrum is to replan to meet the sprint goal. Do you have a sprint goal every sprint? Is it just something the developers make up? Or is it something that stands behind the plan that the product owner has put on the product backlog? No, the product backlog is a list of sprint goals that appear as product increments, and then they're broken down into these things called product backlog items, which are just units of internal administration. They are not units of delivery. That's a feature factor, and you're playing project management if you're doing it that way. A sprint delivers a single product increment, which is a nice, chunky, nice piece of new functionality, rather than a list of 30 PBIs. And the product backlog's in delivery order. Well, if it's a product backlog, there's no user stories. A user story is a requirement. No, this is not requirements that the product owner gives the development team. It's a description of what to build. The product owner designs the business solution, not the developers. The product owner owns the product, hence the catchy title. And they communicate that through the product backlog. So it contains product increments. And PBIs are just units of internal administration. Well, okay, maybe you don't know product backlog. So a lot of the patterns in here are trying to clarify the foundations of Scrum, because a lot of people think they know them. I mean, it's just a list, right? A list of requirements. Oh, I mean, I remember a list of requirements. I know what those are. No. So the patterns clarify misunderstandings. There's some other things that kind of you don't find in the Scrum guide, but they're extremely important, and most excellent Scrum teams do them, like birds of a feather. These are core competency groups or competency development groups. So a Scrum team is a unit of delivery. They deliver features. But we have other organizations that may gather around an interest in the Java programming language. Or maybe all the people who are interested in learning about testing want to get together now and then and talk about testing or about UX. And this is an opportunity to decide what books should we be reading, what conferences should we be going to. And these are called birds of a feather. And good Scrum organizations have this. So here's another pattern. Does your Scrum organization have birds of a feather? Groups that get together for competency development, that keep advancing the organization in its knowledge and state of the art. Swarming. This is my favorite pattern. This kind of goes to the deep principles of Scrum. And again, it talks about what is really a technique. But if you're not using this technique, then you probably don't understand Scrum and its roots in the Toyota production system. So what this says is the entire development team works on one PBI at a time. And this comes from the Toyota notion of one by one product production. So you're only working on one thing at a time, and you keep working on it until it's in an end user's hands and generating value. That's the ideal. And so this solves a million problems. It solves problems with inventory. It solves problems with rework. It solves problems with communication. There's an immense amount of theory that's tied up in this swarming pattern. This is an extremely powerful pattern that touches a lot of other patterns, but very few Scrum teams do it. I go in and I look at these, and I mean, everyone has on their headphones and they're typing away at their terminal and working individually on their own PBI instead of everyone working on one PBI at a time. Swarming, really fundamental to Scrum. Good housekeeping. Another part of the whole Toyota mantra is zero defect tolerance and Kaizen mind, always getting better. Keeping the floor clean, keeping the shop clean. When you go home at night, ideally, you should know of no bugs that you are leaving at work. Clean up all the bugs at night. Make sure all the SVN branches are checked in. Make sure all the builds are clean when you go home. So when you come in the morning, you can start real feature development and do something awesome. So good housekeeping, keep a clean house. Clean up every night. Yesterday's weather, how do you know how much the team's just going to take into this sprint? Well, let's see what we did the last 3 sprints and take the average of this and forecast that we will deliver the same the next sprint. A lot of teams try to do the project management thing. Very few teams really understand velocity. So there's a lot of people who criticize velocity and say, you know, velocity is causing us a lot of problems and it's demoralizing us. And it's basically because they don't understand it. And so instead of trying to understand it, they criticize it. And then they don't need to do it. Yesterday's weather, very important pattern. Enabling specification. The product owner owns the product. And at sprint planning, the product owner has already taken all the user stories and has a perfect vision of what the developer should build. And it's the product owner's job to get them to build exactly that. And the developer should have a perfect vision of what to build at the end of sprint planning. If they don't, the product owner has not done his or her job. And if they haven't, what should the team do? If the product owner has not really told them every error leg, everything they need for the GUI, everything they need for exceptions, everything they need about interference with other features, everything. If the product owner hasn't told them that, the developers should go to the beach. Go on strike. Make it visible if this product owner has not done his or her job. Scrum makes things visible. And the developers deserve perfect requirements and a perfect vision of what they're going to build. So we have enabling specification.
Okay.
This one.
May I interrupt you for a while?
Yes.
For a second, there is one question which has a lot of votes. It's about user stories.
Yeah.
So the people are asking, what's the difference between user story and PBI?
So a user story is a story written by a user. Now, ideally. Now, very few users write user stories, but it's usually of the form, I as an X, so as a subscriber, as a customer, as an account holder, whatever, want Y so that Z. It's a requirement. It's not a solution. It's in the problem space. Here's a problem I have. I, as a user, want this so that I can do this. Okay? It's a statement of something I want to have done. It's not a solution. A product backlog item is a solution. So the product owner says, well, we can enable you to do that by building this. Here's what the screen will look like. Here is the use case. Here are the exceptions. Here's what the preconditions are for the database. Here are the post conditions for the database. I think that will solve your problem. What do you think? Let's have a discussion about that. Maybe I should build you a prototype and we can try it out. Oh, okay, well, we built the prototype. Oh, I learned something. I also need to do this. And then the product owner can turn around to the development team and say, hey, guys, I know what to build. You're going to build this. Oh, by the way, if you want to know, the user told me a whole bunch of requirements. They said, I as an X want Y. The product owner probably will tell them the so that Z. Why does the user want this? So that last part of the user story, the motivation, is something that the product owner will probably tell the team. But is this an attachment to the PBI? The PBI is something that we built. The product owner designs the product, the business solution. The development team builds the product that the product owner designs. And what a user story is just a requirement. And the requirements are what we're going to try to achieve by building a solution. That's what a user story is. It's a requirement. Okay, we can have some more discussion about this later.
Thank you.
I'm going to skip over this pattern because it's a little hard to describe. So it takes a long time to describe, but I've included it in the slides as a reminder for people to go look it up. This is an extremely high discipline pattern, a very advanced pattern. So this is highly advanced Scrum technique. And I wanted to include it in the list here to show people for some of the more advanced stuff that we have in these patterns. Very few Scrum teams are able to do this. But this is how you get exceptionally high quality. Dependencies first, a very simple one. Make sure that your product backlog items are in delivery order and that you've dealt with dependencies very, very early. If you are at the middle of the sprint and you're still discovering new dependencies, abort the sprint. You're not going to make it. Tough love. And I think this is the last one, METASCRUM. This is the interface between management and development, because management always wants to steer the product owners. Well, great. We'll have a meeting once a week where management has the opportunity to steer the product owners, but the product owners still have the final decision. You know what the real purpose of this pattern is? Managers soon figure out that they really don't have any power. They step down as managers and become product owners, and soon you don't have any managers left. This is a drain the swamp pattern. All right. Just in conclusion, some pointers to some other resources. I mean, if you want to get the book, it's on Amazon.com. You can both get a Kindle and a Dead Tree version. The book is online at scrumbook.org. And so I'm not here trying to sell books. I mean, if you you don't want to buy the book, the whole thing's online. You can see it at scrumbook.org. Announcement of conferences, events, courses, and things like that. We have a Facebook page. We also have a LinkedIn page. I don't use that so much. And we are offering a number of courses. All the courses that I'm aware of, I try to put on the Facebook page, and you can also see them at my home page, which is listed there. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Let's check some questions if we have something open still. We have a couple more minutes to close the official part. We will review the questions now. Feel free to go to the slideu.com and slide. Or just copy paste the link from the chat. If you have any questions, you can put it there. We can then vote on them, and Jim will try to answer it. Good. So thank you. You can now stop voting. And Jim, can you see these questions, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So let's answer the top 3. What do you think?
All right. I should be able to give some pretty brief answers to these.
Okay.
How can the product owner order the product backlog in delivery order if the product owner doesn't have the technical knowledge about dependencies? A good question, and the product owner probably does not have the knowledge about technical dependencies, but the developers are there and they will tell the product owner about them. Hopefully the product owner is meeting with the developers every day at backlog refinement, so they're never more than a day out of date, and they're working on the product backlog for the next sprint. And as we saw in the exam, the product backlog is a joint effort between the product owner and the developers, but the product owner has the final authority. The product owner can override the team for business reasons. And the reason is we have to give the product owner control because we're holding the product owner accountable. And to hold them accountable without giving them control is not fair. So yeah, I mean, they have the information they need. They're getting it from the developers. They don't have to invent all this information themselves. Second question. I've mentioned not a fan of certification. How best to educate yourself? Certification is probably the worst way to, well, I guess it depends. Do you want training or education or wisdom? So if you want training, then great, certification is great. Certification, training is what we do for dogs. And so if you want to do what a dog can do, train your brains out and get your certification, and you too will be able to do the kind of rote things that we can teach dogs and even earthworms to do. I do not train, I educate. Education is a noble pursuit that will allow people to challenge themselves and to explore, experiment, and learn. Learn means changing behavior. And last, there's wisdom, which is based on deep insight. Now, you can look at the Bloom taxonomy if you're really into educational theory. And there are two Bloom taxonomies. There's a cognitive taxonomy and the affective taxonomy. Nobody ever talks about the affective taxonomy of Bloom. And for the cognitive taxonomy of Bloom, I mean, this goes all the way up into things that must be learned but can't be taught. Like how do you synthesize? You just have to have experience. So this is about getting your hands dirty a lot. It's just about years and years of hard work. So a lot of time and really being engaged. That's how you educate yourself. And I am really more interested in education and in wisdom than I'm in training. And certification is about training, not about education. Where do I see the role of managers in an agile organization? So the first thing you should do when going to Scrum is fire all the managers. There are no development managers in Scrum. I went into a company and they were running Scrum, really struggling. They struggled with this for 2 years. I found a video from them on YouTube. They had fired all the managers, all the directors. They fired the CEO. And now they have reorganized and they run the whole company with product owners organized by Scrum teams. This is Bosch IoT. This is not some small little startup company. Now, that said, if I look beyond product development is building the product. I still need someone to build the company. So if I have a large company, There's still stupid questions like who pays the electric bills? Who does the accounting? Who locks the doors at night? Who cleans the coffee machine? If you read Lean Startup by Eric Raymond, he says, we have a role for doing all of those things, and that role is called management. So the role of management is basically two things. One is they're Uber Scrum Masters. So they are there to bring big resources to support the team if the team needs that support to get their job done. The other thing is that in Scrum, we say Kaizen, 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 Kaizen. We like to use this fancy Japanese word. Well, Kaizen just means small, humble, incremental improvement. What makes companies great? Is Google great because of their A/B testing, because of Kaizen? No, they're great because they found a radical new way to index information on the web. That's an extreme Kaizen. The Japanese use the word kaikaku for that. How do you make an extreme change in an organization? You can't use Kaizen. Who manages kaikaku? That's managers. What product do we need to kill? What new product do we need to start up? What partnerships will we be forming with other companies? What new funding sources do we have? What marketing initiatives should we have? And so forth. These kaikaku things are the role of managers, and they're outside the role of the Scrum team. There's a pattern called Involve the Managers that talks about this. There's some other management patterns as well, like METASCRUM, that talk about the role of managers. So we're going to get rid of all the managers like Google did. Wayne Rossing fired all the development managers in Google in January of 2001 because they were tripping over each other and giving people confusing orders. People didn't know what they were doing. They got rid of all the development managers, and then you let managers manage the corporation, let developers manage themselves and manage the product.
Thank you, Jim. I think that could be enough from the official part. I want to thank you for all that you have joined us today.